Well, first of all, as people are finding their seats, let me welcome you to what we hope will be a continuing series of evening events at the Nieman Foundation. Last month, the lab, Nieman Journalism Lab, had an evening event like this, and the topic was a little bit closer to home. It was the Boston Globe. And it was looking at the question of the institution of the paywall that they were about to do and now have done. So that was a very topical moment. I hope you'll all feel that this is topical too, even though it's very distant from us in a lot of ways. And this is really to explore the Arab press. Let me introduce myself and then who I'm joined with here. My name is Melissa Ludke, and I'm the editor of Nieman Reports. Nieman Reports is a publication that's in its 65th year of being published by the Nieman Foundation. I like to think of it somewhat in the thank you, Mommy, in the tone of almost Abraham Lincoln. It's written by journalists, for journalists, and about journalists. And it's really been part of this institution for most of its life. And I've had the pleasure of editing it for about a little more than the last decade. I will introduce the two people next to me as we move along. I'll just give you an idea of what my intended format is. I'm going to start with just a brief introduction as the moderator, try to give a little bit of a sense of an umbrella for the evening. We're going to listen to a brief audio from an NPR correspondent who happened to be a Nieman Fellow with me 20 years ago here, Deborah Amos from NPR, who I think can bring us onto a page of very interesting content in the scope of what we're looking at tonight. And then we will move on and hear from each of our panel members for about 5 or 6 minutes with an overview. And then I want to go to all of you so that we can really make this not a monologue but a dialogue. So that's my intent. And so let's move along. Where did this idea come from? Well, it came from looking at the world, as I often try to do as a journalist, and asking questions about what is happening out there that's a transformative moment in journalism. And it didn't take much to think about what's happening in the Arab region, in the Arab country, and with Arab journalists. So we did a number of stories in our last issue of Nieman Reports. We called it Arab News, Troubles, and Possibilities. And I think that title actually still holds tonight. In this case, we have made tonight's topic be the Arab press. Can it keep up with political transformations? And of course, just this week began with a political transformation in Tunisia with its elections. We're looking ahead to elections in Egypt. We've had the situation in Libya come to a rather dramatic end last week. We still have, of course, revolts going on in Yemen. We have the situation in Bahrain, very unsettled. We have Syria on the top of our list every morning. We wake up to find out what's happening there. So as I think about the Arab press and think about ways for us to put this under an umbrella as we begin our time together tonight, I think the first thing we should avoid doing is thinking of it as the word it. There is no Arab press. There's no such thing as the Arab press. In every Arab country, there are those who are doing the work of journalists. The circumstances they now face, the societal, political context in which they work, are all very, very different in each of these countries. Syria is certainly not Tunisia, nor would a discussion about journalism in Syria be recognizable to what's happening now in Tunisia. The same goes for any other comparisons, Libya to Egypt. You can do any of these combinations. Independent journalism, as we know it in this country, does not have roots in the Arab experience. Al Jazeera has perhaps sent a jolt through the Arab region in a sense of perhaps being the closest to that model of independent reporting, but that's been a bit challenged too by its coverage that took place in Bahrain and some of the political circumstances, and we can talk about that a bit later if we want. So in this region, I think it's helpful to think about journalism as sort of seeking a definition at a time when new media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, blogs, are playing a major, major role in how we think about the transmission of information. So I think it might help us to think about this as sort of an ecosystem not in opposition, but one of embracing the tools of new media while seeking definition for what journalism is in the context of these political transformations. And that's why we came at this title. I'd like to now go to the piece by Deb Amos, but before I do, I'd like to frame it in the following way. I think we tend to see a lot of headlines here, and we hear a lot and watch a lot on the blogs and the rest about sort of the Twitter revolution or the Facebook revolution. And I think it's sometimes really important, particularly when we're trying to think about what journalism is in the midst of all of this, to remember that these tools, these digital tools that we have, aren't always tools that always can be used for democratization. And I think Deborah's story will help us to frame that, and then we will move into our conversation up here. I think we're going to hear Deborah's story. Oh, there we are. It's NPR, in case you didn't know.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. I'm Audie Cornish. We begin this hour in Syria. The government there is struggling to put down a 6-month-old rebellion by citizens demanding political freedom. Sophisticated web surveillance of anti-government activists has led to arrest. Pro-government hackers use the web to go after the opposition activists and their cause. And it's turned the internet into another battleground. NPR's Deborah Amos reports from Beirut.
Syria's embattled government insists there is no uprising in the country and explains the unrest this way on Syrian TV. It's a fabrication, says the announcer, an international plot. A satellite image zooms in on sites outside Syria. The announcer says replicas of Syrian cities have been built. That's where French, American, and Israeli directors create protest videos, she says, using actors, cinematic tricks flashing on the screen. For those who don't quite buy this heavy-handed propaganda campaign, a cadre of young, tech-savvy Syrians is waging a more sophisticated pro-regime effort, flooding Facebook, news sites, and web pages. They call themselves the Syrian Electronic Army, conducting the most intense cyber warfare in the Arab world, says Gillian York with the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
You know, I've really never seen anything like this before, like the Syrian Electronic Army, which just seems to have so many members. I think it's really just their level of persistence and their level of activity that sets them apart.
Are they part of the regime? That's uncertain, says York, although Syrian President Bashar al-Assad saluted the youth of the Electronic Army in a June speech when they first emerged.
So it may be that they are supported by the government, and it may be that they are independent pro-government forces.
Either way, this army has created a stir by hacking hundreds of websites, most recently of Newsweek, the U.S. Department of Treasury, actor Brad Pitt, and television personality Oprah Winfrey. To refute reports that Syria's uprising is a demand for political freedom, they blame terrorists for the violence, a message that matches the government's consistent line.
This is something that Iran, I think, has helped Syria with immensely.
That's Josh Landis, an American academic who writes an influential blog on Syria. He says that when the protests began, the government's response was to try to close the country to outside information, banning almost all international media. The Iranians, says Landis, counseled Syria to mount a more sophisticated response.
You've got to train up a cadre of young, hep Syrians who can get on all these social media, and that's what they've tried to do.
Do you think that it's effective, or it is simply a nuisance, for example, an attack on Oprah's site?
Well, that sort of attack, I think it's all 10 thumbs. But to have young voices that are sympathetic to the regime, if the Syrians don't do it, the regime doesn't do it, they're going to lose even their own supporters, because the message is just going to be so one-sided.
The Electronic Army counters the protest demand for change with a message of fear, says Landis.
This is a religious war, this sectarian war, they're going to kill the Christians, they're going to kill this, and they try to scare a much wider umbrella of people.
For months, young activists had the upper hand on the web, organizing online, evading a security service that could do little more than monitor all cell phone calls. Now, it appears the regime is catching up, as demonstrated by the hacking skills of the Syrian Electronic Army, says activist Alexander Page, the alias he uses online.
So it's definitely become a much more serious. And I think that people have to understand that. People have to see that the Syrian Electronic Army is capable of getting hold of activists through what they're doing.
The internet has become almost as dangerous as protesting on the streets, as activist Amr Sadek. because after arrest, activists are forced to contact friends.
At the end of the day, you will never know who is actually sitting behind that account and looking at that, not monitor. The security forces are using his account, are using his identity to know about their moves. That's one of the main risks.
The relentless arrests, compromised protest plans, and activists identified from secure lists on Facebook. It's all a sign of the success of this new campaign.
That was NPR's Deborah
Okay,
Amos in
thank you.
Beirut.
Thanks so much. You may have heard from, we did hear from Jillian York, who's with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, in Deborah's piece. And Jillian also contributed to Nieman Reports in our last thing, and I'd just like to enter our discussion here by just quoting something she wrote there. She said, while there is little question that online commentary adds value to the media landscape, is it journalism or is it activism? Or is it perhaps both? The answer, though complex, lies in the existing roles of state, mainstream, and alternative media in the region. Will there be journalists and news organizations? Certainly. And the roles they will play will likely be significant ones in strengthening democratic impulses. But right alongside will be the social media entrepreneurs and enlivened citizenry pushing and prodding, as has been their role so far in these seasons of Arab revolution. Let me start by introducing Rami Khouri, on my left, a 2001 Nieman Fellow. He's been involved in the news media in some capacity or another for the past 40 years. He's based at the American University of Beirut, and he writes a twice-weekly column internationally syndicated by Agence Global. In Nieman Reports, the article he wrote, the subhead is perhaps the most interesting. It comes from a quote from his piece. Young Arabs have little time or respect for their traditional news media. He went on to write, to those who own, manage, or work for traditional news organizations, I offer observations for making progress at a time when there are unprecedented opportunities to create an independent, relevant, and viable news media. These are attributes we've worked toward achieving for decades, and now, while doing this is still difficult, it is possible. Rami, tell us how.
Well, I'll give you my quick summary of the thoughts and a couple of others, but first, thank you for inviting me and for organizing this. Thank you all for attending, and for those of you who are Nieman Fellows, I wish you a great year, as good as the one we had 10 years ago, so enjoy it and don't worry about the weather. And the people around here will be sad for another couple of months because of the Red Sox, but by late winter they'll be over it, so don't worry about it. I would make a couple of quick points. First, journalism in the Arab world has to really redefine its identity and has to become much more relevant and credible because about half of the people under the age of 29 in the Arab world don't trust their media. They don't use it, they don't read it, they don't believe it, except for Jazeera and one or two others like that. So there's a massive loss of credibility, which is why all these other sources of information have blossomed. And the fact is that the young people who are now redefining our history, if not the history of the world with these spreading protests all around the world, they went out and created their own media when they couldn't find satisfaction in the existing ones. So journalism has a big job to do to redefine itself, its relevance and its credibility in a landscape which is incredibly crowded, full of information. The second point, I think, is to just get back to the very fundamentals of good journalism that I learned in this country 45 years ago in university, and we were working with American colleagues and people in Europe and the Arab world, which is to just tell a good story accurately and be fair and be comprehensive. The very fundamentals of journalism. The third point is that I think journalism has to learn to be, as well as a good storyteller and an accurate purveyor of facts, it has to also be an aggregator and a synthesizer of a lot of information that's out there. Many of the journalists working in the Middle East covering Syria are actually nothing more than digital fact checkers right now. They're not generating news and narratives. They're just trying to figure out which of these bits of digital information is actually accurate and I can pass on to my audience. Fourth thing is learn the lessons of Jazeera. Jazeera has 50 million viewers. because it does good journalism that is relevant to its readers, its audience. It covers the stories that matter. It covers it accurately, quickly, and fairly. If you follow Jazeera in Arabic, especially, not English is different than Arabic. The Arabic Jazeera is high-quality journalism, but it has the same problems here and there that any journalism does. They have a bias like Fox and MSNBC have a bias, and the New York Times. And everybody has a little bit of bias, which is okay, but you want to minimize it, and they've minimized it and been able to do a good job. The second thing that Jazeera did is, I believe, it is the first example of real decolonization in the Arab world, and it's digital decolonization. They're the first people who took on, matched, and beat the Western press at their own game, which is why people follow it. And therefore, you need to be able to challenge the Western dominance of the global arena. They did it in the newsreel, and they did it very well. So to understand the lessons of Jazeera, the key to Jazeera's success was quality and relevance. Number 5, the media, I think, or the journalists in our region have to really understand the legal safeguards that they need to operate under. The environment of the Arab world is evolving in a very dramatic way, and therefore the journalist must be deeply engaged in setting these new standards of constitutional safeguards right now as constitutions are being redone. Number 6, they have to, I think, play an active role in the democratic transformations that are taking place, because the critical development in the Arab world now is slowly you will have pluralistic democracies of various degrees of intensity, but you'll have pluralistic democracies in which real citizens behave like real citizens. They help define the policies and the structures of their governments, but they do so in a context of the rule of law, pluralism, and accountability. All 3 of those are critical elements for good journalism. And the last point I would make is to keep in mind that journalism, to be successful, needs to be financially viable, that to know the business of journalism. It's not enough to be a good writer, a good photographer. You actually need to be a good business person. And I think this is an area that the Arab world now has to understand. Before now, it didn't make any difference because all the media was controlled or owned by somebody or funded by somebody, including foreign intelligence agencies, Arab leaders, private business people, all kinds of groups. Now, media and journalism especially have a chance to actually be viable businesses, and that guarantees their independence along with the legal guarantees. So those are the quick points I would make.
Well, I would say you made them quickly and succinctly, and there's a lot for food for thought in there, which we'll come back to. We're going to be joined by now, via our monitor up there, by one of the contributors to our Nieman Reports package, Sabah Hamamu, and she is a journalist in Egypt, speaking to us tonight from Egypt. Sabah, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Excellent, great. Well, we can hear you clearly, so let me give an introduction, and then let's hear from you. I want to introduce her through her work in Nieman Reports, in which she described journalism as being at a crossroads in Egypt. She told this story through her own situation. As deputy business editor at Al Haram, a longtime leading Cairo newspaper, and she is also the founder of Masraya, Egyptian Media Hub, a startup website for new media, and she has her own YouTube channel in which she has broadcast her own videos, starting with videos she began taking at the beginning of the protests last February. She is the author of Diary of a Journalist at Al Haram, and that will be published this fall. Let me give you a sense of what she wrote as a way to introduce her. When a country such as ours has state-run news media with government interference and established practice, and the editorial practices of privately owned news media are influenced by the state as well, then the question becomes whether there is such a thing as independent media in Egypt. To me, the difference is insignificant. Yet in this disheartening traditional media landscape, we find encouraging signs of independent media, in the truest sense of that phrase, being established in Egypt. Sabah, please tell us about what you're seeing for independent journalism in Egypt.
I will start with a brief description of the scene of media in Egypt. Media in Egypt, it's either state-run media, which owned by the government, or it's partisan media, which papers owned by political parties, or recently since 2003 when a new law passed for regulating journalism, the privately owned media, which is so-called independent, started in Egypt a new trend, which, as you just mentioned, in my opinion, is not just independent because it's owned and run by businessmen who, kept close relations with the old regime or the former regime. So the social media, I would say, introduced the first would be called independent media in Egypt when people, citizen journalists, or even traditional journalists who wouldn't have space on their media outlets to put their word or spread their word. So now, with whatever happening in Egypt on the political side, there is another development happening on the media scene. And when Mubarak regime fell in February 11, we were expecting more rapid change on political side or in media side. Unfortunately, things did not change that rapid or as we Egyptian people hoped for. So the regime is not completely filled. The SCAF, the Supreme Council of Army, controlling the country now. So there's still limits. And unfortunately, in the last 2 weeks, there was kind of development that assure us that's still a long way to go, for media or journalists to go through to get their freedom or spaces to write and do independent media. The army stormed 3 TV channels, Al Hurra and Al Jazeera, Mubashir, and also 25th of January channel. They stormed the channel to prevent them from airing clashes were happening in front of Egyptian TV. And then last week, they prevented well-known author and columnist from being on air in one very popular talk show. So this, negative development led to very positive one. When this happened, couple of media people, decide that this shouldn't be going anymore. So just 2 days ago, a new initiative came out to do the first Egyptian people-owned media. It's a kind of initiative to do kind of IPO, initiative public offering, to collect money from people and start TV channel, radio channel, and online maybe website, which should be owned by people and should be run independently. So this is on the traditional or mainstream media. On the other media or social media, as I mentioned in my story, it's either entrepreneurial media or NGO media or media produced by activists or journalists. Lots of development happening on this side, lots of development happening in YouTube and Facebook and more and more even mainstream media depending on these trends on social media. So even though it's going slow, but I would say it's going on. And Egypt as a country is in transitional period. And when like human being, when a patient in transitional period, you need the patient to be settled. We need a new law to be passed, and we still don't have a parliament. There will be an election for parliament 19th of November. So I can understand that things like we can not change everything in a couple of months because we need the patient to be settled. We need the country to be settled. We need a parliament to then pass new laws and then going to another stage. Even though we have seen this development of people going out to ask for a free and independent media and owned by people media.
Sabat, I think that you've opened up so many opportunities for people here to ask questions that we'll come back in just a few minutes. I mean, the news you're bringing from just 2 days ago about what's happening, I certainly had not read that, and that's absolutely a fascinating development. So let us have Amal speak, and then we're going to open it up for questions, and we can all then, ask for responses from everyone, or people could ask specific questions back to you. Thank you so much. Amal Bashara is an assistant professor of anthropology at Tufts University. She teaches there on course on human rights, media, and the Middle East. She is currently completing an ethnographic study of U.S. news during the Second Palestinian Intifada. And in a paper she gave me to read, and she's already published about the news-gathering role played by Palestinian journalists during the Intifada, she wrote, "Arabs are so often represented by the mass media in one-dimensional terms. And Arabs, like so many other Western people, non-Western people, have been presumed to be unable to objectify their own cultures, to represent themselves." She went on to say this about Palestinians who work in ancillary roles, utilizing their intensely local skills as they assist Western journalists to tell the story. Since foreign correspondents, editors, and professional norms wield much more power than stringers, translators, photojournalists, and reporters in creating the messages of international news, the Palestinian role in the process of representing their society does not regularly shape the overall viewpoints expressed in the news. So as part of this ecosystem that we're talking about tonight, I think it's incredibly valuable to explore the role that local journalists play in working often with Western media in the effort to try to tell the stories of those places. There are challenges and opportunities. Amal.
Indeed. Thank you again, Melissa, for organizing. It's an honor to be here with these panelists and also with all of you. I actually don't get to speak so much to a journalism crowd as an anthropologist, so this is a real honor, and I look forward to hearing what you all have to say as well. My work, of course, is kind of two steps away from some of what the topic of Arab journalism during the Arab Spring. Obviously, there wasn't the same kind of a spring in the occupied territories last year. And also my work is, again, on the relationship between Palestinian journalists and U.S. foreign correspondents, the way they work together. So, Palestinian fixers, producers, cameramen, photojournalists, these people who do ancillary work, but also sort of the constitutive work of gathering information and images that sort of make up the news that we read and see every day, even though we don't get to see their bylines. In most cases, it is kind of the digital fact-checking that Rami mentioned in many cases. It's gathering the fundamental information about events that are happening on the ground, often moving that reporting to bureau chiefs and editors. Palestinians might be out in the field in Nablus or Jenin, sending that information into Jerusalem, where it's sort of put into a story. So there's a few things I wanted to, the idea of an ecosystem I think is really important here. Thinking again about how these Palestinian journalists, though generally unrecognized, are an important part of this ecosystem, and thus sort of part of the news that we read and see every day, and hear every day. I wanted to talk a little bit about what I call skills of proximity. These, we generally think of distance as an important journalistic ethic and sort of approach to information. But one of the things I like to emphasize is that Palestinians bring specific skills to the work that they do because they're close to the events that they cover. So I'll just talk a little bit about sort of the skills that are used to cover demonstrations, since that is certainly a crossover between sort of the kinds of news that Palestinian journalists work on and some of the most important reporting that went on during the Arab Spring. One way I studied, I did this sort of ethnographic work on the production of U.S. news, which meant that I was shadowing a lot of journalists, spending time with them in a lot of different capacities. And I found that my sort of embodied experience in the field was a really important part of the way I was able to learn what journalists did. And it was embodied in the sense that I did not have the embodied skills of Palestinian journalists. I learned really fast. I learned at the funerals when I absolutely could not follow the cameraman who made it from the back of the funeral to the front of the funeral to right next to the person being buried, for those images as the person is lowered into the grave. And I really learned it at demonstrations. I did not have these journalist skills. So, for example, I was at a demonstration against the separation wall in Abu Dis. Everything seemed to be going fairly smoothly. People were walking by, where the journalists were all standing. writing graffiti sometimes, carrying their flags and signs. And, I was following what the journalists did. It was a big day, so they were actually doing stand-ups set to a U.S. News schedule. All of a sudden, Israeli troops emerged from behind the wall. Stones were in the air, and I heard these noises. I had no way of interpreting what these noises were. There were explosions of some kind, right? But I really didn't know. And then all of a sudden, I was enveloped in these clouds of tear gas. This was new for me, right? And I was really disoriented. I couldn't see where I was. I didn't know the streets around me to know sort of where people might be going from here. And again, there were these booms, but I didn't know were they sound grenades, which just make a big sound, but are not necessarily, they're not anything particularly dangerous. Were they rubber bullets? Were they live ammunition? I did not know. So it was all over pretty quickly. I gathered my composure again to return to the journalists who, had managed this all fine. And when I went home that day, I realized how important these auditory skills are. Understanding what's going on around you, and of course, in situations of even of greater conflict, you can add a whole other list of sort of sounds that one would need to be able to interpret. What kinds of planes are above you? Is this Palestinian gunfire or Israeli gunfire? What, where is it coming from? All of these auditory ways of interpreting what's going on around you. Local geographic knowledge. Where are you? Where is everyone else? Where are they moving? All of these things that are necessary to understand what's going on at a demonstration. Of course, having gone to these demonstrations multiple times also helps you understand what's going on, because you know the kinds of strategies that both soldiers and protesters might employ. Even in the Occupy Wall Street protests going on now, a few of us learned about what kettling was a few weeks ago when police officers, it seemed, led protesters onto the Brooklyn Bridge and then arrested 700 of them. If you've been to a lot of protests, you might be looking out for that kind of thing. And I'm sure there are many other strategies like this that people would be looking out for at various kinds of protests in the Middle East. So basically, the ability to sort of interpret these protests as they're happening on the ground is a skill that Palestinian journalists have from their experience of usually having gone to these protests as demonstrators, not just as journalists. And they are able, this is just one of the many ways in which they are able to help foreign correspondents interpret the world around them. Of course, another element is language. Being able to understand what the person next to you is saying without having to think much about it is another critical skill for Palestinian journalists at protests. So I'm sorry, I actually planned to read, so I'm just going to read a little bit here at the end. One pernicious stereotype of Palestinians and other Arabs holds that all they understand is force. If taken seriously, this misconception raises a question. How is it that people who only understand force can be involved in making news that is central to our democratic society? One obvious and important way to answer this question is to critique the premise. Of course, it is true that Arabs do not only understand force. They also, as historians of science and advocates for Arab Americans would remind us, understand algebra and astronomy and poetry. They understand satellite television and cell phones and Facebook and blogging, as we've seen in the last months and years. But alternatively, another way to refute this idea that all they understand is force is to point out that while this idea is presumed to be a cultural trait, it's no coincidence that Palestinians and other Arabs about whom these characterizations have been made have largely been ruled by force. That is, another way to approach this quandary is to consider the possibility that a special understanding of force might be a particularly enlightened position from which to report on military occupation or authoritarian regimes or uprisings against those authoritarian regimes. Now, obviously, the Palestinian context is somewhat different. I don't know the extent to which we can say that journalists in the Arab world, obviously they have been discredited as institutions to a great extent. Do they have these kinds of on-the-ground skills of reporting demonstrations when they did happen over the last decades? And are those important for covering demonstrations today? We heard that the Facebook generation, there was obviously a lot of praise of the Facebook generation in Egypt and other places in the Arab world, And one thing, one kind of answer to that was that the Facebook generation actually relied on the Muslim Brotherhood to handle demonstrations, right? It was the Muslim Brotherhood activists who'd been out in the street before, who'd faced the police and so forth, who knew how to make it through those situations. Is there kind of a parallel that the new media journalists and perhaps the younger journalists relied on their older colleagues who'd been reporting on these stories for decades, even if they didn't get to report on them in free media institutions? Did those younger journalists rely on the older journalists to even just interpret what's going on around them?
Great.
Thanks.
All right, let's open it up and have you all ask some questions. Let's get a discussion going. People have experiences to bring to the table. Let's bring those along. Does someone want to get us started, or anyone have any questions to head that way? Chuck, go ahead.
My friend Bob Mnookin wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last Monday, and it was very much a minority view, but with which I agree 100%. He said this prisoner deal was a disaster.
I'm sorry, that what?
The prisoner deal.
The prisoner deal. Okay.
My own view is it reveals Israeli weakness, whereas the Israeli state from the very beginning has set out to prove that it is tougher or more tough than any other party. So this undermines it. For what? 1,100 prisoners for one man.
Okay, Chuck, here we are, we're entering the political realm. Can you frame it in some way in the journalistic realm? I mean, you talked about it as an op-ed piece. Rami, do you want to try to bring us into some kind of journalistic discussion about how this story's been covered?
Well, I would say, first of all, don't read the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal. Read the news pages, but, I mean, read them if you want a right-wing view, but don't, if you
Bob
want
Mnookin is an expert on negotiation.
Yeah. Personally, I think, by the way, I
Sabah, can you hear us? Are you able to hear that question?
I haven't heard it because, there
Okay.
was lots of noise around the question, but if you can briefly say it again, I'll appreciate that.
It was a question having to do with the Israeli prisoner exchange and sort of the two rounds of that, I guess, and some commentary on it. Rami's now responding, and if you can hear him, then if you have something to add to this.
Well, I will comment and link it to journalism. I find myself reading the Wall Street Journal now every day for their really good international coverage. I'm surprised and pleasantly surprised. The editorial pages are very conservative and in some cases orientalist and sort of almost racist against Arabs and Muslims, but that's their option if they want to do that. On the prisoner exchange, I think about the politics of it is, I think it is a very positive step that shows that, first of all, 79% of Israelis felt positive about it, they supported it. And Palestinians were happy and celebrating in the West Bank and Gaza. So this was a win-win situation. And the politicians see 79%, bells go up in their head because that means people support them, etc. So my guess is it's a very positive deal. I don't think we can judge it in terms of weakness or strength. I think it's political realism. For the Israeli people, getting prisoners back alive is a very important thing. For Palestinians, getting prisoners back alive is a very important thing. And therefore, this was a win-win situation, and I think they can build on it. The journalistic dimension of it is, I think the American media, by and large, the mainstream media, has done a lousy job, as they tend to do usually when covering Israeli-Palestinian affairs, in putting the context of the fact that Hamas and Israel have many times made agreements with each other, ceasefire agreements. They've even had some agreements near the borders where Hamas people are in charge of some villages. So I think a wider context of this would be useful for the American media to present, but they don't. There's a problem that the American media has with Islamist groups who are militarily resisting Israeli occupation or the siege of Gaza. It's fascinating to watch the American media now report about the Islamists in Tunisia. Rashid Ghannouchi, the leader of the Islamist Ennahda party that just got the plurality in the Tunisian elections, suddenly, today and yesterday, he is a moderate Islamist. Suddenly he's been given this label moderate. It's amazing. What it is, it's very obvious. What it is the nincompoops who run American and Israeli policy in the Middle East realized that they made a terrible mistake in boycotting Hamas in accepting the overthrow of the FIS Islamists who won in Algeria in 1992, they realized that this was a colossal mistake, and they're now trying to respond in a different way to the victory of the Islamists in Tunisia. You'll have something similar in Egypt and other places. I think so. You're seeing an adjustment, but it doesn't apply to Islamists who fight Israel, because Israel and oil remain the two red lines in American policy in the Middle East, and this is a problem for Americans to solve. So that's the journalistic angle I would give.
Okay, great. Amal, do you have something to add to this at this point? I know your research goes back in time a little bit, so I wouldn't. Sabah, do you have I know you're taking a sip right now. I've caught you in the middle of a drink there. But do you have something you'd like to add to looking at maybe how this has been covered in Egypt?
And a little thing that also related to whatever Rami said about redefined journalism and the whole how we see journalism in the Middle East and Arab world is that was having the same discussion less than 2 hours ago with a colleague of mine who quit medicine career to be a journalist, and we were talking about how to see the way forward, that it's not only raise the limits for freedom of expression or write our opinion. It's redefining the whole scene of making it more informative, more analytical, more document, more information there, not only of saying our opinion. And I was having another discussion with a colleague of mine who works at Al Jazeera English, and he was posting something about how we, even though we need all these changes and development in media, also in some way, we don't trust ourselves much. Many times we would translate, the Arab press would translate a report from Washington Post or New York Times and post it and give it more space. And with all respect and with all appreciation of what American media did and the whole, long history of American media, many times the local journalists who would be covering the story would have more information and more insight and more background information about the situation. So maybe even though with that, the same story, if it came from a local journalist who's covering it, might not having the same space, the same reception a story coming from New York Times or Washington Post would receive. And me and my colleague discussion was how to credit ourselves more of knowing the situation and knowing the background and environment of our own world.
Sabah, you sound like you're very much along what Amal was talking about in terms of the wealth of local instinct and information that the Palestinian journalists themselves bring to this, but the lack of control they have over the story and the lack of ability to be the conveyors, of this information themselves.
And actually, I'll just jump in and say something quickly about the prisoner exchange and the hunger strike, the Palestinian prisoners' hunger strike that came right before it. I actually am a big proponent that the new social media are absolutely not going to cut out a role for journalists, because obviously they do critical investigative reporting and they are sort of authoritative sources more than sort of any person on the street would be. But in terms of the hunger strike, I found that being on Facebook was actually a really interesting way to follow protests that were going on in lots of different places about the hunger strike and about the prisoner exchange, and to get information from a wider range of sources than one could have found anywhere else on news. News sites.
Okay. Introduce yourself, if you would, and also try to speak up so Sabah can.
All right, I've never been accused of having a library voice, so that won't be too bad. My name is Paul Barron. I'm at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and I want to thank you all three for your wonderful presentations. I have a question from an observation, and the observation is that a variety of forms of quote-unquote Arab media have become now legitimate sources for information gathering and retention in the American information context. Chief among this might be Al Jazeera, but it could go to some other ones. Al Masri Al Yom could come as an online portal for an Egyptian news source, as another one of those. I'm wondering, can you, from your variety of experiences, talk about the way you think that will provide a critique of traditional American-based media gathering techniques and or impacts, and how this might reshape the landscape of media here, or news gathering here in the U.S., but explicitly from some of these quote-unquote Arab media sources.
Okay.
I would say that it really depends on the nature of the demand in this country. The United States media, even if they're like NPR and PBS, they have sort of some financial independence, are market-driven. They're audience-driven, market-driven, and they have to, in most cases, be profitable, at least get a big enough audience to sell enough ads to break even. And therefore, the American audience, if the American audience demands better reporting, then the American media, which has some really outstanding reporting, but the mainstream is, I think, pretty mediocre, pretty unbalanced on the Middle East, and on wider Islamic issues now. Not just, it used to be just Arab-Israeli stuff, but then it became terrorism, and now it's become Islam. It's much wider, the problems are much wider. So it depends on the demand. If there is a demand, then the reporting in the Arab media, which is much more nuanced and much more in-depth, because the people on the ground know these societies well and write about them, will filter into the American media in some cases. But also what you're getting now is with the digital realm, you can get Americans who could just log into Jazeera or some of the other stations. I know, for instance, that some of the other major press media in the Middle East have contacted me about they're going to start English websites now, some of the major Arabic ones, because they understand there's a demand for this. Just as, and when I said I called Jazeera digital decolonization, one of the extraordinary things is not that Jazeera has done well around the world, it's that the Americans and the British and the French and the Russians and the Chinese and the Germans have now all jumped in to create Arabic satellite stations because they don't like people to be decolonized. They want to try to maintain control of this global information flow and tell our story. And they have a hard time dealing with independent, sovereign, self-determinant Arabs who can actually do good journalism. And so you're going to see a nice competitive marketplace, which should be good for everybody. It'll improve the Western media where it needs improving, and it'll improve the Arab media, Middle Eastern media as well.
Sabah, were you able to follow that conversation?
Yes, I would like to add a little thing. In 2006, I was in Pittsburgh having 3 weeks fellowship, and then it was the midterm election. And next day of the election, I found one newspaper that is pro-Republican, has the 4-page praising the Republican. The another newspaper, another main newspaper in the city was the Post, was praising the Democrats. So that struck me at this time, like there is no such thing in the whole world called independent media, or there's always sides. So now it's not that far, in here, in this region. Even though Al Jazeera produced great example of, even though it's funded by the Emir of Qatar, it's, keep the ethics of objectivity and informativity and analytical approach. What would also the media scene here in the Arab world present wouldn't be in the mainstream media, with all respect, would be, I would say, more in the new media and entrepreneurial media, especially on YouTube and new websites. In the last few months since the revolution in Egypt started, I saw several very, very great initiatives. And now this initiative they can make money from this online channels or Facebook initiatives. So there's lots of changes here. And I think this would be deserve to keep an eye on this experience in the new media, even more than the traditional media.
Okay. Nick, did you have a question?
Yes, this is a question for Amal, and basically I'd like to draw you out on the relationship between fixers and foreign correspondents. Mm-hmm. And I speak against the background of having been a correspondent in Moscow, knowing Russian, and observing many of my colleagues who did not know Russian. And my conclusion is that, of course, you've got to rely on fixers. That's a fact of life. And you probably can do a good job relying on fixers, but you can't probably do an excellent job. Because if you don't know the language, and you don't know the history, and you don't know the background, there are many things that are going to slip through your fingers. So my question really is, are the journalists, the foreign journalists in the Middle East, First of all, what is their Arab knowledge? And secondly, how sensitive are they to the fixers? Do they treat them with disdain? Do they treat them and understand that they have a lot of very detailed and intimate knowledge that they could make good use of if they could understand it?
Excellent question. Well, and I think the contrast between Moscow and Jerusalem is an interesting one. My understanding is that journalists tend to learn the languages of the places they're going. First of all, if based on the ease of learning the language. I mean, it's relatively easy to learn Spanish. It's quite hard to learn Arabic. The other factor is the relative geopolitical power of the place where they're going. So working in Moscow, one needed to speak Russian, right? Working in Jerusalem, first of all, it presents a lot of complications. One would need to learn 2 languages, which is 2 difficult languages, right, from English. And so very few people do. Also, working in Jerusalem, again, the geopolitical factors mean that American foreign correspondents are often closer to their Israeli sources and to Israeli officials than they are to Palestinian officials and sources, because in a sense, that's where the axis of power lies, and in the same sense that they're in a sense closer to American officials, right? So they rely on Palestinian fixers and producers quite a bit for access to Palestinian officials and also for interpretation of Palestinian politics and society more generally. I think there's a great diversity of relationships among foreign correspondents and fixers, and I think oftentimes there is a great respect. Oftentimes those fixers have longer institutional memory than the foreign correspondents. So you have, Melissa did a fascinating interview or led a forum with Taghlid al-Khodri, the Gaza fixer for the New York Times, who has left for also really complicated and fascinating reasons. But I mean, she'd been working in Gaza for longer than Ethan Bronner and probably before James Bennett, the person who came before him. I mean, she'd been there for a very long time. And that's not unusual. So they have long institutional memories, extraordinarily deep connections with people in many communities, and so I think there's a lot of respect. Sometimes foreign correspondents will work with a fixer just for a day or for 2 days, and obviously then the amount of trust that they have in the fixer is less. So that's an issue. If I could comment on the previous question as well briefly.
Why don't you do that? Remind people what the previous conversation was, or the question, so that we're back on the same page. But
about sort of Al Jazeera and how, whether or not U.S. Media can benefit from the vitality of certain of those media outlets. I think it's fascinating with Al Jazeera because a lot of times, just in a sense, the way that foreign correspondents and U.S. media institutions might do with Palestinian journalists, they take the material without taking the narrative, right? So they take the footage, because, for example, Al Jazeera was the only one on the ground in Kabul and in other places during some of the hottest moments of the wars of the last 10 years, right? The American news media needed those images. They didn't take the narrative, right? And in the meantime, of course, the U.S. military, bombed Al Jazeera bureaus in Kabul and in Baghdad, imprisoned journalists from Al Jazeera. So there's an utter lack of recognition, I think, from various American official sources of the validity of Al Jazeera as a source, even as U.S. media institutions absolutely rely on their material. I think this question about decolonization, your point about decolonization, Rami, is so important. I mean, we can't, of course, watch Al Jazeera English in this country because it's not carried, and I think that's sort of the flip side of them trying to, we can't easily watch it, right? It's still not carried.
It's carried in only, I think, 4 locations now. I think New York City just became one of them a couple years ago.
Here in Cambridge.
Here in Cambridge is one of them. I think Burlington, Vermont, and a few other places, but it's pretty rare. You can go on your computer and watch it. You may not be able to see it over your TV set, but you can go on your computer. Did we get a question from Twitter?
Oh, we did get a question from Twitter.
Okay, and it is.
This one was kind of directed at Romney, but anyone can answer. Just asking what journalists should do to fairly cover the revolution in Syria, since the government's been blocking access for journalists.
Okay, did everyone hear the question? It's about coverage of the revolution in Syria, because as Deb Amos's story pointed out, Syria has prevented the foreign press from coming in there. I should say that she was able to go in for 2 days, about 2 weeks ago, did some reporting from there, but was quite explicit in how she was minded during her time and how difficult it was to really do much reporting. Rami?
I'm not a reporter in terms of covering news anymore. I write columns and stuff like that, so, and analysis. But if I was covering this as a news story, I would use the same technique that I use now as a columnist, which is get the stories from both sides, use the telephone to talk to people you know inside Syria, and it's easy to get contact from there. But the most useful source that I find is people coming out of Syria, Syrians or foreigners. And without mentioning names so that nobody gets in trouble, I've talked to a lot of people, Syrians and foreigners, who come out of Syria. It's easy to come to Beirut, and some of them come to the day, and these are not journalists. These are people in all walks of life, and they're coming and going all the time. And so you can get a reasonably good picture of the general mood of the place and the sentiments of a lot of different people. And otherwise, it's really hard to do it, because the Syrians are trying to keep a really tight lid on what's going on. But the way that it's been done now, using mostly the YouTube feeds and things like that, is really tricky, because some people will start using that for disinformation as well, which is easy, easy to do. But the point is that in the final analysis, what the Arab uprisings tell us, I believe, is that Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and stuff play really important, critical roles in very short periods of time that sometimes last only a day or two in getting information out or spreading the word. The real dramatic stuff happens in face-to-face encounters on the street. And it's the same for reporting. The real important stuff happens when human beings meet each other and exchange, because you've got to have the element of trust. If you don't have the element, there's no trust in digits. There's trust in the face in front of you. And trust is critical to this process.
Sabah, I'm wondering if there has been coverage by journalists in Egypt of what's happening in Syria now and what that might look like at this point, or how they're going about telling that story in Egypt today.
Well, actually, it's been very hard, not only for the international journalists or Western journalists. It's very hard for, we have a correspondent, Abu Ahram, who is based in Jordan and Syria, and he found it like almost impossible to go into Syria. But I have an answer for your question, because in last December, I was going through road trip, Jordan, Syria, Turkey, and then Iran. And I happened to spend a couple of days, it was calm by then, in Aleppo. And then, of course, I kept some contacts. And I would recommend whatever Rami said at the same time, because if you depend also whatever you see in Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, to be honest with you, sometimes I saw something about Tahrir Square, which is 5 minutes away from my home, where I'm speaking from right now. And then when I take a taxi and go to Tahrir Square, and the scene there is not as it was in Twitter when I saw it. So I cannot put trust 100%. What would a correspondent do to get a good grip of a story? In every country in the world, there is a Syrian community. So, and every person has his own family or friends there. So if I'm working on a Syrian file, I would, if I don't have access, and I won't have access to Syria at this moment, I would make a network of friends, of families, of people, the community, Syrian community in my city, and then keep communication with them to see the situation in Aleppo, in Damascus, in Homs, by phone, and to increase this network day by day. So whatever happen, an accident or escalation happening, I will contact this network and get the information confirmed from more than one source. And then this network will grow, eventually.
Terrific, thank you. John, you had a question.
I have a couple of quick questions and related questions for Rami, but I'd be happy to hear from the others too. I'm John, I'm a fellow from the Philippines. First, would you agree with Melissa's opening statement that there are that independent journalism has no roots in the Arab world? Perhaps in recent history, yes, but in all of history? I find that a bit problematic, because that would mean that the models would be non-Arab. Second, And on the other side, why is it that when Al Jazeera and other Arab media outlets go into English to capture the English market, it's okay, but if the Western media go into Arabic, it's to control the flow of information?
Well, on the second point.
Oh, you want to do the second one first?
Yeah, then I'll go back.
Okay, then come back to me.
Because I hesitate to disagree with Melissa.
No.
My history may not be as deep as John's, that's very likely, so
I'll
go
put
to
it
the
off as
second
much as
point
I can.
first, okay.
I didn't mean that it's not okay. It's perfectly fine if they do good journalism. For instance, France 24, the French station, I think is quite good. BBC is pretty good. Al Hurra TV is terrible. The American State Department funded Arabic satellite station. So, and the Iranian Press TV, which is similar, they have an English thing which they want to reach the world. So if it's ideologically motivated, then it's lousy and it's a waste of time and it's insulting, frankly. If it's not ideologically motivated, but it is designed to promote the free flow of information, that's pretty good. But I don't think anybody does these things, spends millions, hundreds of millions of dollars because they think people around the world should all be well informed. But there is clearly an ideological motive behind all of these efforts. They're mostly government funded, and so I'm a little bit dubious about them. But they can sometimes do very good journalism, and therefore we have to judge them by their final product. On Melissa's point, I think what she meant was that in the modern period now, in which case I agree with her as I always do, because I think in the modern period, you haven't really had independent journalists. I mean, you have, but they live in London and they live in Los Angeles, but they can't operate inside the Arab world. Except, again, when Jazeera broke the mold and created something new. And there was the only other exception to that would be some people in Lebanon. In Lebanon, which is the only place where you had really quite an open space of freedom, a liberal environment in which to do journalism. But the problem there is that most of the media outlets were politically controlled by somebody. So you had a lot of space to do a lot of stuff, but it was all very polarized and ideological. You didn't have a lot of really independent people who were financially independent and therefore could cover their stories according to their own judgments rather than the political sentiments of somebody else. But historically, I think it's very important to keep in mind in Arab history, in the Islamic period and even going before pre-Islamic period, that there are elements that are really powerful elements of Arab and Islamic and Middle Eastern values. Accountability is one of them. The concept of accountability in the Quran and for Muslims is deeply ingrained in their ethics and in their culture. It's not translated into modern political institutions, but it's very, very powerful. It's also there in traditional Arab tribal culture, which is patriarchal, and there's a sheikh who's the head of the village or the tribe, but there are mechanisms of accountability at work that are very important. And finally, you have also going way back into the second and third millennia BC, in Mesopotamia, the very fundamental concepts of Western constitutional republics, the rights of a citizen, the separation between the power of the ruler and the rights of the citizen, independent adjudication to make sure that business agreements were kept and nobody was abused. These concepts all started in the ancient Middle East. So this kind of sentiment is deeply ingrained in the history of our region. When we got to the modern Arab police state, starting in the 1960s, they were all washed aside because you had all these police states or security states running the show.
Should we go on so we can get some more questions in and we'll go around? Dina? I'm sorry, Sabah, yes, and then Dina's next, and then David. Yeah. Go ahead, Sabah. Did you have something to say to that question, or do you want to go ahead with the next?
Very quickly, I won't agree that there's no roots of independent media because around the oldest newspaper that is founded 135 years, that is started by two Lebanese people who came to Egypt and started this business because they wanted to spread the word and knowledge. And this paper was confiscated when they published a story that is unfair to impose taxes on Egyptian farmer that high. So the Khedive Ismail at this time confiscated the newspaper. And also 100 years ago, there is one independent publisher called Ali Al-Gurgani, who was the first Egyptian to travel to Japan. Back then, he was the owner of independent publishing house called and a newspaper called Al-Irshad, or Guidance. And in his story, he wrote that he sold a piece of land that he would have independent fund to fund his trip to Japan to write about some conference was happening there. So later on, the media not being independent anymore, but there's some roots for such independent media in the Arab world. That's
Great.
all.
Good, thank you. I very much stand corrected. Dina.
Hi.
And why don't you introduce yourself with your
Yeah.
affiliation here?
Hi, I'm a Nieman Fellow, and I've been based in Israel, Palestine, and worked for the Jerusalem Bureau of the Associated Press for many years. And Alman, I just wanted to ask you to clarify your point. Is your point that the whole network of Palestinian fixers and reporters aren't getting their voice out, and they're not getting credit in the stories that they're working with, when they're working with the foreign press? Because the Associated Press version, I mean, what I saw was, you know, fixers got promoted to reporters, and people definitely were seeing the stories and directing coverage as well as being behind the scenes. And so, sorry, and then my second question is going to be, what's your assessment of the Palestinian media today, how they're dealing with the Arab Spring? I mean, Hamas and Fatah have mixed feelings about the Arab Spring, of course, so how has that come through?
So I think, you know, if one breaks it down, looks at different institutions and how they've dealt with accreditation and sort of giving bylines or attribution lines, right. You know, you can tell different stories for different institutions. In general, I think that Palestinian fixers, you know, don't get to sort of give narrative. The information that they gather tends to be put into the narratives of bureau chiefs and editors and so on and so forth. And I think it's interesting and telling that in news agencies like the Associated Press, that's where Palestinians have been able to rise through the ranks more. You know, they don't get to write feature stories in the New York Times, for example, right?
But to Greta, I would say, actually, because I've also worked at the New York Times, I thought one of the best stories out of the Gaza war was a piece she wrote, from the hospital, you know, I mean, like, I mean, so she's definitely done some radio.
When nobody else was allowed in. I mean, they had to give her a byline. You know, she didn't get a byline for years and years and years, and she got a byline when nobody else could get in because, you know, the person who's on the scene used to get the byline, you know. And after the war, you know, the number of bylines that she got, or shared bylines, went down quite a bit. So I think that it is a system that has some give, but you know, I'm sort of trying to characterize it in general. And then regarding sort of Palestinian media today, I also just wanted to sort of tack on and think about independent media, throw another model into the mix. What about Palestinian media between 67 and 94? So since 94, Palestinian media has become more and more like other Arab medias, right? More and more under the, you know, repressed by the Palestinian Authority. Between 67 and 94, it was under direct Israeli censorship. But it was very much an oppositional media, right? So, you know, anything the Israeli censor didn't want published would not be published, but it was independent of the authorities and, you know, in that it wasn't certainly hegemonically controlled by them. So I think that's kind of another model. Yeah. And another way to think about what's the relation between that underground media or oppositional media and new media today, you know.
I just want to follow, and have the Palestinian media been good at tapping into new social media tools, do you think?
To a certain extent, and it's a very NGO-ized media, you know, it actually is not really going on a capitalist model so much because there's not enough money for that, but it's all about NGOs.
And party affiliation, too.
And party affiliation, but I mean, I think people don't, you know, they're not addicted to Palestine TV, you know, the PA's Palestine TV, right. You know. Yeah.
Rami, quickly, and then we're going to
just add to that, the role of internet, digital media, cell phones, all of these communication systems for Palestinians is paramount because of the nature of A, their fragmentation, and B, the Israeli control mechanisms of occupation, siege, and separating them. So you've got Palestinians within the West Bank, villages that are 20, 30 kilometers away, can't travel very easily sometimes. So the media have emerged as the digital media are unbelievably important for Palestinians, not just as a tool of communications, but as a mechanism of digital reconfiguration of nationhood and a sense of the integration of the community. It's very, very powerful stuff that has to be better understood by scholars.
Great. David.
Thank you. My name is David Skok. I'm a Nieman Fellow from Toronto, Canada. I'm also a digital journalist and believe in all that digital has to offer. But at the same time, I wonder, you know, if we're skipping over the big player in the room, which is the state-run broadcaster. And I'm curious to hear from Sabah about Nile TV and how, to use a former example, the SABC, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, when apartheid ended, there were a ton of North American and international media outlets that came and provided aid and training to the SABC in how to be a free press. And I'm wondering, at the moment, where is the state broadcaster, first of all, in the sense of how many people actually watch it in Egypt? Number two, has the coverage changed? And number three, has there been any support offered or any training that has come in for this particular tool?
Sabah, were you able to hear that clearly?
Yes, well, the state TV had its largest scandal in the revolution, and it's run and owned and by the state for so long, since its establishment in 1960. And then when the revolution happened, the state TV was broadcasting the Tahrir Square empty of anybody, while the Jazeera and Arabiya and BBC airing the right size of the square full of people. So, and then after the Mubarak regime fell in February 11th, the state TV came out and say, we apologize, we forced it to do this coverage, and then let's start and open a new page with our viewer, and it's a new era for Egypt and for the state-run TV. Unfortunately, they fired the Ministry of Information, who is the top management leader of this institution. Unfortunately, he was a journalist and a former correspondent of the military. So he has instruction to do whatever the military or the SCAF, Supreme Council of Army Forces, see. So recently, in 9th of October, the clashes that have been mentioned happening between the peaceful demonstrators and the army, many people died in the street, and then the state-run TV came out to Egyptian people telling them that they should go out and defend the army against the Egyptian people who are attacking them. So there was another campaign to against the Egyptian TV, humiliating it and asking everybody to boycott it. To answer your second question, who watching it? Of course, TV lost its credibility after the revolution, and then even after this, this campaign to regain its credibility. Now nobody almost trusts it, so people turn to Al Jazeera and BBC and Al Arabiya. And back to my first introduction. To be honest, I want it to be, reformed now. I want it to be developed now. I want a new system in it right now. But the system itself, the country itself, is still in transitional period. The army, who is in control of everything, is still there. So I think, to be realistic, this movement of developing it and offering training and reform it constitutionally won't happen until we have parliament, until maybe we have a new president. And now the army said, I'm going to stay for 6 months, and then I will hand over the country for a new president and a new parliament. This should be happened last month. It did not happen. We will have the election, and reforming the state-run TV, one of the top demand of people, because Mubarak regime did not kill people in the street with guns and with the police. Media kill people when they called for Egyptian to go kill people in the square who's betraying their country and having money from outside sources. So Mubarak regime unfortunately used the TV as a tool to kill and to disseminate wrong information. And of course, I think there's lots of opportunity to a chance from international media, from American media, from BBC, from different other institutions in the world. But I think this, the regime itself is still there. But it was in Mubarak, now it's in the SCAF, the Supreme Council of Army Forces. So it won't give up this tool easily. We will need to have independent, institutions like the parliament and president and civil, government. So that's not happening right now.
Thank you, Sabah. Jonathan.
Hi, my name's Jonathan Blakely, and I'm a Nieman Fellow this year. I've been to Iraq and Libya and Egypt several times for the last couple years. And I can also confirm that with Al-Hurra, yeah, it's given very little credibility, at least in Baghdad. No one gives it any credibility. But I'm wondering if we can talk about, staying on this subject, if we can talk about Libya for a second, because you have brother leaders gone, and you've got a free, the press is there, Western press is able to pretty much, the binders are gone, you can pretty much travel there anywhere you like, whereas a couple of weeks ago, you couldn't go anywhere without a minder, if you could go anywhere at all. But I'm wondering if you could, and maybe it's too early to talk about this, but what's next for Libya's press, where they're starting from zero? And, right now you've got the BBC there and NPR's there and a lot of Western media are there, but soon, with the exception of the BBC and a few others, the Western media won't be there either. So what's going to be happening there in Libya? What can you predict, or what do you think? You've got a de facto state-run TV there, de facto if you want to call it the NTC channel, but what's next there?
Well, I've never been to Libya, and I don't know much about it, but that doesn't prevent me from talking about it. Being an Arab journalist. My impression, I know a lot of Libyans outside of Libya, and they're just outstanding people, and the relationship is they're outside of Libya because they're outstanding. They had to leave. They couldn't do good work in Libya under the Gaddafi regime. My impression is that Libya's challenge is much, much more difficult than, say, Iraq or Syria or Yemen or other places, or Egypt or Tunis, because you don't have real deep structures of nationhood or civil society or any kind of independent activity in Libya. You had this very bizarre system that was set up by Gaddafi, which really was very strange and didn't allow any real serious institutions to develop. So they're really almost starting from scratch. But they have tens of thousands of qualified people, tens of thousands of qualified Libyans around the world and all around the Middle East. And I think one of the phenomena that we will see, and we'll see it in Tunis now very quickly, with the beginning of the democratic transformation and the rebuilding of the credibility and legitimacy of the institutions of state, is that people will start going back. Once it's stable, they feel that it's physically stable, security-wise, they will go back. And so I think they will develop very credible institutions. I have absolutely no doubt that they will do that. It'll just take them a little bit of time. The question, and there the press will be a mirror of other things in society. If you have a decent governance system, decent security, and other things will follow, education, media, etc.
Very much like what Sabah's saying about the situation with the broadcasting.
Well,
Sorry.
just to follow up, is Qatar's hand a little too deep in Libya right now when it comes to they established the phone system, and they're running that TV channel?
I don't know the depth of, Qatar was involved in the military side and the aid side and the oil side. Frankly speaking, I don't mind if Qatar gets more involved, because most of the things that Qatar has done have been quite positive, I think. I don't have a big problem with Qatar being involved if it's one of many players. And the problem with Qatar is that it doesn't always follow through on some of its activities. They started a lot of stuff in kind of Arab human rights, and that kind of quieted down. But the stuff they've done in media, the stuff they've done in education, the stuff they've done in other fields has been very impressive. And they have a lot of money. The big question is, why is Qatar doing all this? Nobody can figure that out. Why did they start Jazeera? Nobody can figure that out. It's one of the great mysteries of the modern Arab world, but it's a good mystery. We like it, because most of what Qatar has done, I think, has been very impressive. And the other thing about that is Qatar is actually acting like a normal state, like a normal country, which most countries in the Gulf haven't been acting as normal countries. They're proxies of somebody else's interests. But Qatar, and now the Saudis have started acting like a normal country, even sending their troops around. We like it, don't like it, doesn't matter. But they're actually developing a kind of a sort of a normalcy of statehood in their foreign policy, which is really fascinating. So there's a kind of rite of maturity going on throughout some of the Arab countries. So the Gulf countries are developing this, while some of the other Arab countries are being reborn as more legitimate states.
Great. Why don't we take one more question, and then I just want to say that you're all welcome to join us for a few moments afterwards so we can continue this conversation. We have a little bit of food and beverage out there, and we hope you'll join us before you go out into the cold. Razak.
Well,
Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Razak Saidi. I was a Nieman Fellow 2008. I'm from Iraq. I have some comments, if I may.
Yeah.
And so many people here talk about the Jazeera and as a model and Arab board of the independent and independent media and objectivity. I've been following up Al Jazeera for a long time. So the main keys of Jazeera's success is the money and the lack of competition. So at the early of the 90s, with the new era of the satellite channel, so Jazeera had the chance to form the channel. You ask a question about the mystery of Al Jazeera, I can't help maybe. Al Jazeera, it's a Saudi project, not Qatari project. So Saudi Arabia, they decided to form an Arab news channel. And so all the staff were trained by the BBC. And then the BBC showed a scandal of one of the Saudi princes. And that made the Saudi Arabia angry, and they discontinued the deal. At that time, there was a coup in Qatar. So the Prince of Qatar held a coup against his father. And the father was a close friend with the Saudi royal family. And there was a personal dispute between the Prince of Qatar and the Saudi royal family. So the main goal of Al Jazeera was to attack Saudi Arabia. But that was in 1993. There was no any Arab channel news. And the other factor, which is Qatar have huge money. I'll give an example in Iraq. I've been working for New York Times in Iraq covering the Al Jazeera had in every corner there's a stringer for Al Jazeera. No one can do this. No one has this money. And I remember my bureau chief, he interviewed the Prince of Qatar in the 90s, and he told him that from his pocket he paid millions of dollars every year. You know, there was, you know, have you remember in the 90s there's commercial on Al Jazeera? And all of us, he said, you know, it's not a profit object. So maybe this is the two main factors. If you check the Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera Arabic, there is a huge difference in the coverage. I'll give you an example. In Bahrain, check Al Jazeera English and check Al Jazeera Arabic. I've been interviewed, by the way, by this teacher. I'm sorry, Al Jazeera English. So I find there is a big difference in the coverage. So Al Jazeera English, they know about the English audio. Al Jazeera Arabic, they know about the Arabic. If you check Al Jazeera coverage, do you think they have the same coverage in the Arab Spring in Egypt or Libya or Bahrain? You can find, the difference. So they are very successful. I'm not against them, but I'm just, this is my comments. Yeah, they are very successful and they are very professional, but they are very biased. And I have tons of stories I can say, especially about Iraq, when there's bombs, when the terrorist bombs, when Al-Qaeda said, oh, we exploded, and there are hundreds of civilians killed, and I found Al Jazeera, they said, the target is a police station. Mm-hmm. And there is like 2 kilometers, there is a police station, and maybe one glass was, broken in the police station. So I just want to add, this comments, because I, as an Arab, and I don't think Al Jazeera it's the perfect model for the future of the Arab media. We need a new model, and we need really independent and really objective, not with money or not with bias, or to be used as a tool for the raising power. Yeah, Qatar is it's a new center of gravity to the Middle East. Al Jazeera is one of these tools to achieve these goals. Thank you.
Okay, let's have a brief comment back, and then we'll adjourn and hopefully carry on the conversation.
Yeah, I would just comment that I don't think it's very biased. I think Jazeera has the same proportionate bias and the same deficiencies of any really successful, quality, and credible news organization. CNN, BBC, Le Monde, take any of them. Any really successful New York Times has problems, has bias, has leanings, and it shows. And they all reflect the sensitivities of their owners and funders, which is how life works. But I think the biases are really quite small, and they are there. But when you look at what Jazeera has done in terms of the quality of the reporting, because why is Jazeera good? Because it gives you spot news, it gives you analysis, it gives you opinion, gives you entertainment, and it gives you the views from both sides. I remember watching the Gulf War, or the Iraq War in 2003. I had one of the ligaments. I was kind of stuck in my editor's chair at the Daily Star, and I was sitting there with a TV set every 20 hours a day, and I'd be flipping from Jazeera Arabic to CNN, BBC. I really was monitoring them all. It was really interesting. And far and away, Jazeera was the best of all of them, because they gave you all the sides. They gave you Rumsfeld live, and then they gave you, the local Iraqis, and they gave you other Arab people, they gave you the Israelis. So they did a far better job than anybody else, I believe. But they do have those deficiencies, but I think they're minor. And I think what we need to do is build on learn the lessons of Jazeera, and then build on them, try to minimize those deficiencies. And the way to do it is by competition. And Arabiya has provided a bit of competition as the sort of more formal Saudi finance channel. And others will come along. So I think this process will evolve now with a more open Arab world. It should be very, very exciting. But it just goes to show that this can be done. And the Arabic and the English versions are different because this is what successful people do. They know their audience, they know their clients, and they cater to them. So they give them.
They are very professional. But maybe they are objective or they are, accurate. So.
Right. They cater to their clients, like the New York Times gives you the Boston weather here and the New York weather in New York, and so does Jazeera.
Well, this obviously is a conversation that can continue. Sabah, I realize that it is 1 a.m. your time, and so all of us give you a round of applause for joining us so much.
With you, thank you very much for giving me a chance to be part of this wonderful conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, you made it very special for us, so thank you too. And I wish you a good sleep. Thank you. And thank you to Rami, thank you for Amal, and thank you to all of you for coming.